get to have me introduce lots of things today, depending on where you are. I actually am not going to introduce Lindsay this morning. I think that there are lots of people who are in this room specifically because they saw Lindsay's name and they said, I must be at that workshop. For me, that workshop is about the pedagogy that I want to apply in my classroom and what I know is associated with great evidence-based practice that really works. Lindsay is a long-time supporter of the English Teachers Association. He's one of our go-to experts and we really appreciate the support that he offers us. He's got a wealth of teaching experience over so many years. You've still got your English Teacher Guru website. He doesn't like being called the English Teacher Guru, and yet there is the website.
I know.
Please enjoy Lindsay's work today. I'm always fascinated to hear about what Lindsay has to say about writing the literary response essay, and I'm really starting to think very carefully about the way I use his work to help teach our students and prepare them better for external assessment. So I hope you enjoy.
Thanks. Hello everyone, welcome to the session. I couldn't remember whether it was morning or afternoon there, that's why I hesitated what I was going to say there. You can see, obviously this has applicability to Unit 4. I have to get used to saying them, not, second semester Year 12. Apparently we're not allowed to use those terms anymore. But this is obviously applicable to the external exam in particular. And how this came about, it's actually a good segue from what Julie was saying. That term guru got put at the end of my website address and my email address because the original moniker that I'd come up with for a website address, my website developer said, "Are you serious? Nobody will ever remember that." He said, "I'm going to call you English Teacher Guru. People will remember that." I felt really uncomfortable, but you know what? He was right. But the lead into what we're going to say here is this. Thinking about this issue of analysing complex text has really come about working with people, because I actually find that I learn quite a lot when I'm working with teachers in schools throughout Queensland, and also when I was at UQ working with students there. And one of the things that to be honest, really staggered me when I first started talking to people about this stuff was there weren't transferable frameworks being used for analysing texts. So students were going from book to book, and it seemed to be that everywhere I was going it was really book-specific things they were learning and not frameworks they could apply to other texts. And even more disturbingly, when I started, I shouldn't mention the university now, but anyway, when I started talking to the undergraduates, the pre-service teachers about this, who remember fourth year university students, and most of them have been through a BA English, I actually discovered that most of them weren't taught systematic frameworks for analysing text as part of their BA. And when I was involved in providing some advice on the redevelopment of that degree, I discovered that it wasn't really a part of what they thought they needed to do. So where do English teachers get frameworks to teach kids? Which is a bit of an issue, I thought. So what I sat down to think about is, okay, if I had to teach, or in fact I started from my perspective, first of all, when I read a book, what do I do? And obviously I would highly recommend this book if you haven't seen it, not even sure if it's in print anymore, but it's the Cambridge Introduction to Narrative. Really, really great book. You have to translate it to be useful for secondary students, but it's a very, very good book. And I went about developing something which I thought would work for kids in schools as a bit of a transferable framework. I'm going to say very quickly, if you did schooling in the 1970s or before that, even maybe some of you, I don't know, is anyone that old? if you did schooling in the 1970s like I did, this framework's not going to seem unfamiliar. It's very much a sort of text-centred sort of way of analysing texts, which I think we drifted away from a bit in the 80s and 90s. But I hope it's got a 2018 flavour to it with a bit of a injection of critical thinking as well. So that's what I'm hoping to do today, is just talk about a framework, and I said reviewing framework because I'm hoping that for the people sitting in this room this might not be completely new, but also consider what the practical implications might be for preparing kids for an external exam. And really what I'd hope you'd be able to do out of this is do a bit of thinking yourself and thinking, are we doing this sort of stuff in our school? And more importantly, have we got this sequence from year 7 through to 12 in the appropriate way as well in terms of pacing? So this is a reading framework. You have this reading framework in your booklets on page 2, in your handouts, not really booklets. Sorry they're not longer, but I've had so little time to actually prepare handouts and that, and I'm so glad I did, because this 3-page handout for the 200 or so I had to get from them was $71. Yeah. Oh, and I should say that this PowerPoint I will give to Julie or someone, and they'll put it up on the ETAC website, so you don't have to worry about copying everything down from it. Now this is a screenshot which may or may not be able to read very well. I can't without my glasses on, but it's the same framework that you've got on page 2 of your handout, same flow chart. And essentially, and I'll talk this through in a bit more detail, essentially the way that I see it is that and this isn't necessarily the order you read it in, but when you're analysing it, I think it's good to think about how's it being narrated. That is really vital, because that has such an impact on the way you're being positioned as a reader. So you really need to think about that before you do anything else. Then you think about, okay, what's the story world that's being created here? Then you've got the characters who are plonked into that story world by the author. Stuff happens to them, which we call the plot. And as a result of what happens to them at the end of the plot, we make some interpretations, broader interpretations about what that book meant. Okay? And what I'm going to do is sort of go through that in a bit more detail. Before we do that though, a couple of other things. The other thing that I really recommend kids do is read the book at least 3 times. Now, I'm realistic, yes. I'm realistic enough to know that probably at least reading 1 and 2 there is going to be condensed into 1 reading. But ideally, I think this is, and certainly when I do a lot of teacher notes for various organisations. I've done quite a lot for Alan Unwin, done quite a few for Ausclit now on fantasy novels in particular. You can talk to me more about that later if you want fantasy novel stuff. But I think, the first time, one of the things, and I'll emphasise this a few times, but one of the things I think kids need to do is actually read for pleasure. And I think that one of the important things for kids to think about is how do they feel about the text. What were the first thing you noticed about the text? Can you see your own story or perspective in this text? Does it remind you of other texts you've read? There are a set of questions which Kelly McGraw came up with for a brilliant new textbook that's coming out for Units 1 and 2 from Oxford University Press, but I'll talk more about that later. There's obviously a few people who know I'm being ironic there. The second reading is where you start to look at the text in more detail, doing the annotations and that, and then pulling those annotations together and identifying patterns that emerge in the text. All right, the other thing that I want to say before we look at this in a bit more detail is I really think that there's scalability in this model. So I really think it's a model that you can use, and I've sort of done a bit of, proto-testing myself with this, but I think you can do it with short narratives, so short stories and that. You can do it with novellas and one-act plays, and I think you can do it with lengthy novels and plays as well. So I think you can scale it up or down depending on the text that you're using. And I've definitely used it with a short story. When I've been working with some teachers, worked with a short story that was about 500 words long, and it worked fine for that as well. So just to illustrate this and to talk about it, I'm going to use 1984 as the book that I do. This is my 1984 pencil case that I got from out of print. This is what I carry my Kindle around in. And the copy that I've, just so you know, the copy I've used for this is actually the Kindle edition. I don't know about you, but I'm 55 now. Yes, I know I'm getting old. I'm 55 now, but in my life I've accumulated a lot of books. And I have to say that the Kindle is a saviour of our house, because otherwise we would look like crazy hoarders. Otherwise, that's why I like the Kindle. And travelling a lot, it means not carrying big bundles of books with you. Okay, so 1984. One of the reasons I've chosen 1984 is it obviously is on the text list, so I don't think it's one of the external books, but it's one of the other books. I think that's right, isn't it? Yeah. Is it one of the exam ones? Oh, okay, that must be why I chose it. Sorry, I should have rechecked that, shouldn't I? Look incredible now. Yes, it is one of the external exam ones. Thank you for reminding me about that. And I'm assuming it's one that most people will have some familiarity with. Now, if you don't, here's a brief. Here are three brief summaries. The first one comes from 100 Great Books in Haiku. So here's the first summary. And actually, anyone who knows the book well will know it's not actually quite true. He doesn't forget Julia, but they develop a distaste for each other. She certainly develops distaste for him. Here's my second version. This is from 90 Classic Books for People in a Hurry. And here's a sort of synopsis from one of the notes sites. I can't read what it says there, so you might be able to read it better. So it's the classic tale of totalitarianism, and God, I'd forgotten how grim it was. My wife actually hates it with a vengeance because it is so grim, but gee, it's grim. And the other thing that struck me is how sexist and racist it is, but we'll come back to that a little bit later. All right, so the first thing that I think it's worth thinking about then is the narration, and there's sort of two bits to this: who sees and who speaks. And the who speaks bit is really about voice, and the who sees is vocalisation. Now, vocalisation is just the consciousness through which the story is told. But there's different versions of what the different types of vocalisation is. This is the one that I'm using. There's apparently zero vocalisation, but I didn't think that was a really useful one for kids. So I've just used the term omniscient, because zero means pretty much the same thing. So that one's where it's someone internal to the story telling it. External is obviously someone external to the story telling it, and omniscient is someone who, can even drill into people's heads and see what's happening in their head. And then who speaks, so things like, is it first, second or third person? A really useful concept which I don't know that it's done often in schools, but I think it's really useful for thinking about who speaks. The use of free indirect discourse, and that's when you get, the protagonist's thoughts, but the narrator is actually an external third-person narrator. So it's not told in first person. What ends up happening is the narrator's reflections and the protagonist's reflections merge and become almost indistinguishable. And then, of course, reliable, unreliable, etc. Is useful as well for some novels. So if we have a look at this, who speak? Well, first of all, what yes, who speaks? What is it told through? First, second, third person. Third person, so third person narrator. In terms of the narrator, is it internal, external, omniscient? I know it's a little bit hard to tell from this, but yeah, so it's an external narrator. It's actually someone we assume who's external to the story. It's never made entirely clear, but who it is, and it's interesting to think about whether, and we'll have a look at this in a minute, whether the person who wrote the appendix is the same person who wrote the book, the story. But the other, and then as you go through, this is from part 2, chapter 2, just after Julia and Winston have met. And notice the use of the free indirect discourse here. The next moment it was hard to say by whose action was in his arms. At the beginning he had no feeling except sheer incredulity. The youthful body was strained against his own, the massive dark hair. And yes, actually she turned, and he keeps going on, and it's really hard to tell there, is that the narrator's reflections on what's going on, or is that what's going on through Winston's head? And that's a really significant thing then to talk about, okay, how are you being positioned as the reader here? And how is the writer actually doing that positioning? I mentioned before that there's an appendix, and the appendix is about newspeak. And what's interesting about this appendix is it's not written as George Orwell. It's actually also written as if it's someone who's a part of, or some historian of, that world that is described. And as I said before, it's interesting to think about, is that person who wrote that the same person who was the narrator in the book? So, very quickly, going over very quickly, that's who speaks and who sees. Then you can think about the story world, the setting and the context. And when I was doing some work earlier this year for Auslit on fantasy fiction, Australian fantasy fiction, Anthony Eaton, who some of you might know, he talked about the various contexts which as a writer you have to think about as you're producing a book. And I thought his set was quite useful, that you have to think about the historical context, and it might be obviously a made-up historical context, the political context in which the characters are going to be interacting, in particular who's at the top, who's at the bottom, for example. The social context, the cultural context, and then you've got the physical setting. So I'm talking a lot more here about than just where it's set. Okay, it's all those elements, the setting as well. And of course, a lot of the information about the story, while you do sometimes get a little preface which gives you a bit of background that you might want, or think about that really boring first chapter of To Kill a Mockingbird, which gives you that lengthy, history of the South. Most of a good author, and good readers will know this, a good author reveals the world as the characters interact with that world. So as the character moves through that world, you find out more about that world. And just to give a little demonstration, this is the first 2 paragraphs of the book. I've made this a little bit easier for you by highlighting some information we're given. And just very quickly, turn to your neighbour. I'll do a Beryl here. Turn to your neighbour, and Beryl, if you were anywhere around, I was saying that in a positive way. But just turn to your neighbour quickly and just talk about what do you learn about the world just from that information given in the first 2 paragraphs.
What is the characters interact? What do I do? So it's kind of looking for the
All right, I've just stopped you there. Although it's not a great, we've got a fairly big group. Just a few suggestions on what you learn about the world just from those few details that are up there. Yeah, absolutely. The clocks are striking 13. Something's not quite right in this world. Yeah. What else? Yeah. That usual thing where you're setting up, it's a bit like the Valley of Ashes in Great Gatsby as well. There's, if you've read the Great Gatsby, you recognise that as a bit of a motif of corruption and that sort of thing. What else? Yeah, but that's contrasted with the name of the mansions, Victory Mansions. So there's this contrast between the reality and sort of this illusion, if you like, which is so common in a lot of literature, of course. And look, there's a lot more we could say, like who is this? And apologies for the American spelling. I thought I'd edit out the American spelling. But an enormous face, more than a metre wide, the face of a man about 45 with a heavy black moustache and ruggedly handsome features. Who is this person? Why is there a metre wide, poster of him up in the room? And of course this idea that there's no use trying the lift. Well, why? Why isn't the lift working? Etc. So, that's right. For him, this is very normal. Great pickup. Yeah, that's right. So it's this idea that as the characters move through the world, you can pick up a lot about the world, and that's something which kids really need to learn. Okay. If you are doing 1984, the links are a bit hard to see there, but there's a couple of YouTube videos I found when I was just doing some research for this, partly because I hadn't read the book for quite a while. In fact, I'd say 1979 was the last time I read the book in full. But The Dystopian World of 1984 Explained, really good YouTube video, and another one, 1984 by George Orwell, Crash Course Literature 401. Once again, quite a nice little video that talks about particularly the political and historical context in which it was written, if you want to have a look at those. By the way, don't you love my back, the image I found for this one? No, me, yes, that's me as a baby. I was actually fairly cute as a baby. It hasn't helped as you get older though. All right, then, this is a bit grimmer, this one, this backdrop. But then, of course, once you've got that context, and once the kids understand that context, then you can talk about, okay, well, now let's talk about the characters who have been plonked down in this context. And you'll notice that as I've set up this framework, that I have tried to actually make the links between the bits. So I don't call it characters, I call it characters moving through the story world. Because it's not characters you're looking at, it's the characters as they're interacting with that world that they have been a part of. And the characters, obviously an interaction between characters for that as well. Can I tell you that this is the most complex part I found of actually putting together some sort of framework for this. And what I'm going to give you here is sort of just a snapshot of some of the questions that you could be thinking about when you're doing the characters in the story world. But this is really, I think, one of the crucial parts, because books are... okay, if you're reading Matthew Riley book, you're probably not that interested in the characters so much. Okay, because, he would say, I'm not talking about this, but when we had him as writing residence, but he would say that, what he wants is an archetypal character that you understand from page one, and you don't need to go into much characterisation. People know who the character is. Archetypal hero. But if you're reading something like, and so what matters in those sort of books is the roller coaster ride that you're taken on in the story. That's what matters. When you're reading a book like 1984, the story is secondary to the emotional journey that the character is undertaking. And if you read a lot of stories that do well, for example, in the writing task for the QCS test, read, and I'm sure sure this would apply to the NAPLAN test as well. They're not action-oriented stories. They're stories where it's the emotional journey the character goes on which is the significant part. So that's why I think spending a bit of time on characters is actually pretty useful. So one of the things that, and I tossed up, I've got two tables I've done for this. One is based on use of evaluative language. I decided not to put that one in today because I only had 15 minutes for the session. But if you're interested in that, I'll show you where you can see more about that shortly. But this is a framework that I've been using for yonks and yonks and yonks, which I've just modified. And that is thinking about finding evidence from the novel in terms of what the character does and how they do it. Then what does the character think and feel? What does the character say and how do they say it? What do other characters say? How do they react to the character? And what does the narrator say about that character? And that's a bit of a framework, for a generalised framework for analysing characters. Now, in my full versions of this, what I've then got is a middle column which gives language cues for each of those things as well. So, for example, if you're looking for what the character does and how, you might be looking at the doing verbs, the action verbs, and things like there might be a simile there which describes how it's occurring. So he walked as slowly as a snail. That's a really lame one, but you know what I mean. But also the word slowly there, the adverb, tells you how it's happening as well, and that helps give you some indication of what the character is like as well. If you're looking at how the characters think and feel, then obviously looking for thinking and saying verbs, for example. So there's language cues that you can give the kids to really identify these things as well, and then they can make, provide evidence from the text for that in the table. I tend, obviously one of the things you're faced with, of course, is the characters don't necessarily stay the same through the book. So you might want to pick some key sections of the book where you say, okay, I want you to do this for this section, then a middle section, and then an end section, for example. And, just so they can look at the progress. Because I've come up with a number of different tables, and unless you're going to work with a table that's about 3 A3 pages in width, it's a bit hard to do that all in one table, I find. So, and obviously you can do it for different characters as well. So you can do it for protagonist, antagonist, for example. Does anyone want to ask any questions about that? Okay, so if we have a look at this one, we won't do it in the detail that I've got there, but let's think about what happened, what Winston's doing here, what's he saying, what the other characters are saying, and just do what we did before, have a bit of a talk to each other about what sort of person is Winston coming across as here, and what's the textual evidence for that. Okay, I'm sure as English teachers we don't need to check your answers or anything for this one, but can I just point out something which I think is really interesting in terms of why thinking about who sees who speaks here and that idea of free indirect discourse becomes important, is the last line here, he had pulled her down onto the ground. She was utterly unresisting. He could do whatever he liked with her. Now, it's really interesting. It's really hard to tell, is this the narrator saying it or is it Winston thinking it? And think about the implications of that. Like, he could do whatever... Now, I'm going to show you a quote a little bit later, which, if that worries you a little bit, the quote a little bit later might worry you even more, particularly in the post-Me Too movement. Yeah, and I think it's interesting, that she says I couldn't care less, but he's been quite, honest about what he's like. Yeah, what he brings to the table, so to speak. Although I might say the table in this case is a clearing in a wood. If you've read the book, where they don't think there's microphones. All right, so. That's pretty straightforward, I think. But where it becomes a little bit more complex is there's other things to think about, and that is there a contrast between the way the characters act and way other characters react to them? It's interesting, isn't it, that he, as I said, he chooses to say them, she says, I couldn't care less. Now, who does that say more about, Julia or Winston? And I think that, one of the things that's actually... well, it's introduced pretty explicitly, is Julia makes it very clear that she slept with a lot of men. And she's not very picky. In fact, she tells him at one point that the first man she slept with was in a party member who was 60 or 70 years of age. But then, do the characters obviously change over the novel? Is this for the better or worse? And we'll talk about that again when we come to the last two paragraphs of the novel. And how does this change compared to the way that other characters in the book either change or don't change? And what I'm trying to do here, there's a fuller sort of set of questions you can have a look at elsewhere, as I said before. But what I'm trying to give the kids are some questions which they could apply to any book that they go to. So it doesn't matter if you're doing Jasper Jones, you're doing Hamlet, you're doing 1984, whatever. You could apply these same questions to that book to get you thinking about why that book has been written in the way that it has. And there's other things like I think you can then sort of classify it. So, and this might, the order here, you might do them in slightly different orders, but who are the protagonists and the antagonists? Who are their respective allies? Is this, now if it's a genre novel, what becomes important is there an archetypal role that they fulfil? So in fantasy, there's an archetype of the chosen one. And a book that I have written about and have used actually in a textbook that we've been doing for Oxford is a book called Lady Helen and the Dark Days Club, and she is the archetypal chosen one like Harry Potter is. However, what Alison Goodman does in the novel is makes her a chooser, not just a chosen one. So she gets to choose whether she's going to let herself be the chosen one or not, in a way that Harry Potter actually never really gets to do. So, even in fantasy, in genre type novels like crime, genre novels, the ones where if you go into a bookshop, you've got the fiction section with lots of novels in them, but then you've got the crime section, the fantasy and sci-fi sections, etc. So the genre ones are the ones that actually get named in the bookshop. Mainly for marketing reasons, I'll say, but anyway, we won't go there. And then, of course, are there contrasting characters? So there's obviously, in 1984, various contrasts that have set up and various relationships between those characters. And this is, once again, from one of the... I just lifted this because I couldn't be bothered doing my own, and it was a pretty good one. But this is just one of them from the notes, sites online. But, that old-fashioned idea of doing some sociograms to think about the relationships between the characters is quite good, I think. That's characters. Any questions on that before we go on? Anything too surprising for anyone yet? Hope not. Then story and plot. Now, the reason I separate these is because story and plot, anyone who's done English extension will know this, story and plot are not quite the same thing. The plot is sort of the way that the story unfolds in the novel. So the story is, if you're going to take something chronologically from beginning to end, and it might include stuff that happens actually before the novel begins, but then within the novel itself, the way that unfolds within the novel might be quite in a non-linear fashion. There might be stuff about the story that's simply inferred that you have to work out for yourself. So there is a bit of a difference between those two things. And if no one realised, that's the dark, handsome man with the moustache from the previous selection. That's Big Brother, staring down menacingly at you like our Australian government once they can get a backdoor into our phones and that. I only mention that because isn't 1984 seems so prescient now in many ways for us. Now here, this is putting the characters into the story. And the way that I put it, you'll see there is stuff happens to the characters. I just put in because I was talking to myself and I think, there's just lots of stuff happens. I thought, that's quite a good way to put it for kids, I'll put it like that. But basically what you want to think about here is by the end, who wins and who loses. And there's not always a clear-cut winner and loser either. And we'll talk about that in a moment with relationship to Winston. Who changes, who doesn't change? Often the bad guys don't change, and that's often one of the ways you can tell the protagonists from the antagonists too. And I think this is a really important one if you're thinking about positioning, is kids need to imagine what other choices could have been made by the author and what other choices could the author have given to the characters at each choice point in the novel. So Winston makes a number of choices which have particular consequences. And, it's interesting to map out what some of those choices, what different consequences might have flowed from those choices. So here's the final two paragraphs of the novel. It might even be the final paragraph, is it? Anyway, this is the very end. So anyone who hasn't read Big Brother, you're about to have the ending spoiled for you, at least in some respects, but just have a quick read of that. Now, if you've never read that, you might look at the end and go, oh, isn't that nice? This is a gay incest novel, and he's in love with his big brother. Isn't it a happy ending? Anyone who's read it will know that it's actually a fairly grim ending because this, totalitarian regime that he has been fighting against for a large part of his life wins utterly and completely. And the interesting thing, you may or may not remember this, but what Winston had expected to happen to him, he would be taken to the Ministry of Love, which of course is the ministry of we're going to really grill you and interrogate you. He's taking the Ministry of Love, but he's expecting he's going to be arrested at some point for all the things that he's doing. He doesn't know whether it'll be in a week, a month, 6 months, 5 years, but he knows he will be arrested and at some point he will be shot and killed. But there's actually a much crueler fate awaiting for him, and that is that he becomes the person that he never wanted to become. And it's what makes the story so grim. The totalitarian government wins totally and utterly. I've thought about this quite a bit over the last week or so, getting back into 1984. I'm not entirely sure what the meaning of the novel is, except this emotional gut wrench that you have at the end of the story. And maybe that's it. Maybe it's not something you can put into words specifically. Anyway, what we now need to do, of course, is we know how the story ends. Now we need to think about making meaning. And that image is supposed to think, well, there's all this stuff swirling around now. We now need to bring it all together somehow. And one of the things that you can, of course, do is to track some of the themes and associated motifs. Themes are often used as a synonym for meanings, but in fact, if you look at literary books on literary theory, theme is an abstract idea that is repeated throughout the book. So in this book, you've got things like surveillance, dissent, love, power and freedom. They're sort of abstract ideas that sort of are repeated as you go through. If you're looking at something like Pride and Prejudice, obviously marriage would be a theme. And then often associated with those themes, you get various motifs, right, which are more concrete, tangible sorts of things associated with them. I tossed up whether to include the brotherhood there because they're not actually a tangible thing, but they are a thing that gets mentioned a lot, which is supposed to be a motif of, there is a dissenting group in the society, but we never, the implication is in the book that they're just set up by Big Brother and the state to actually trap people like Winston. And then I left these blank to think about others. By the way, if you don't remember the real chocolate, that's one of the first things that one of the things that when they get a room, and they don't have to bang around in the bush anymore, to put it crudely. When they first get a room, Julia actually brings real chocolate, and there's this. It's a really revolutionary thing for them to do, is to eat this real chocolate in this room with no telly screens. So, I've just got there for you to think about other motifs as well. And then you need to bring that, and what that gives you to get you thinking about is, okay, well, in terms of the way the novel unfolds, what does Orwell have to say about surveillance, dissent, love, power and freedom? And I'm sure there's, as I said, there's other things you could pick, but obviously with kids you can't do too many. So what does all this mean? What messages might we take away from the novel? And I think that this is really, the really important thing about why that personal response stuff is really important, because you need to come back to that and you need to be able to say, okay, for your world at your time, what meaning does this have for you? Because reading 1984 was a long time ago. But of course it wasn't meant to be a long time ago when he wrote the novel. It was supposed to be in the future. And that's why a lot of us actually stopped doing 1984 from 1985 onwards. And it's come back into use again. Now, the big bit that I want to talk about here, though, is actually the last 2 dot points there, and that is, how might the text be read resistantly, and who or what might be ignored or pushed to the margins? In other words, marginalisation in it as well. And I think this is a really interesting question to ask for the external exam. are they asking for an invited reading, or could you do a resistant reading? Now, the way I read the criteria, through the perspective that I'm reading it, is I certainly think there is opportunities for kids to write critical responses, not just interpretations in their external exam. And in fact, depending on the school that I was at, I would probably encourage some kids to write critical responses, because one of the things, and look, I know something about the work that went into the 8 books that are there, and I don't want to sound like I'm being critical, but I am going to make a critique of them, and that is that they're very white. Those books, they're very white, you look at them. I think it's four of them are British, one's Canadian, 2 are Australian, and there's one other, maybe it's 5 are British. So there's a lot there that you could really sink your teeth into, particularly if you're coming from migrant families and that sort of thing, where you could actually be reflecting on those fairly critically. And I'll just give you one example of a bit that I found, which I found, I really don't know what to think about this bit, to be honest, but have a read of this. By the way, this occurs just after that scene, the other scene we had a look at before. Rereading this, I couldn't help but feel a bit uncomfortable. And uncomfortable for a couple of reasons. One, and look, I know, before anyone jumps down my neck, I know Orwell was a person of his time and all the rest of it. However, reading it from the point of view of 2018, I do wonder about the use of, and I know what the narrative device is, and I know why this is important for the narrative, but I do wonder about the narrative device of using woman as the corrupter, going back to that old Genesis tale of Adam and Eve as the corrupter of mankind. Because, I'm glad you said that, not me, but that's right. That's right. What's that? Oh, do you want to repeat that?
And there's slut shaming in it too. The fact that she's had many men equals she is impure and therefore bad.
Yeah.
I don't see that she is putting them.
Neither do I, but the fact that he says, I hate purity, I hate goodness, and she's just said that she's had many men. Yeah, but she's had
All right. Now, can I say but this is exactly why just doing an invited reading of this, I don't think is enough in 2018. That exactly the sort of conversation that cropped up there almost spontaneously, and I know someone else up the back, wanted to say something too, but I'm sure that a lot of girls are going to read this, and there's going to be lots of different reactions to that, to segments of this. There's also this really disturbing bit where Big Brother, it's actually towards the end once again, where Big Brother is about to make an announcement, and there's this big bit about talking about the black hordes in Africa who they have to, who might one day overrun Oceania, and it's, once again, I know what the plot device is, but I feel really uncomfortable about this, particularly in a world where apparently Sudanese refugees are running amok in Melbourne, stopping people from going out at night. Last time I went to Melbourne, I didn't have that experience, but I must have been lucky. Yeah.
Isn't that actually where you talk about the context in which the story is set?
Yes.
Isn't this kind of thing isn't he celebrating her rebelliousness? That she's not told
Celebrating what, sorry?
her rebelliousness.
Yes, I think that's the case.
So
But,
you have to kind of include the context of when
Yeah.
writing it. So
Yeah.
even though today we might have a different view,
Yeah.
you might interpret those things differently.
but that also comes down to whether, I think there's a question then there, though, whether this might have been a book for its time, is it a book for our time?
But then couldn't you argue that racism
Yeah.
is indicative of the totalitarian regime?
Oh, absolutely. And that's certainly one of the conflicts I had reading that section is, yes, but this is how he's been brainwashed by, by Big Brother and by the party. So, but, it's because you've got this use of the free and direct discourse in particular, you're all the time thinking, is this what Winston thinks as someone who's been indoctrinated? Or is this what someone who is writing a history of what has happened, because he's maybe he's found Winston's diary or whatever, is it because of that? So, look, I'm just going to leave that there because I saw Julie looking at a watch anyway, and just make the point that what the main thing is that I think that I think all those books on the reading list are ripe for resistant readings, not just invited readings. And this is where we'll get to implications for the external exam. Don't worry, I am almost finished. So, so I think the first thing that I would say is that I think students need to learn transferable analytical frameworks. Whether you like mine or not, I don't care. Well, I do care, but it's not going to end the world if you don't like my framework. If you've got another one you want to use, that's fine. I think that I've thought a lot about this, about what's the best preparation kids can do when they don't know what the question's going to be. And I think they have to be prepared to answer whatever is thrown at them. And the best way to answer whatever's thrown at you is to have a really good detailed knowledge of the novel or the play. That's the best way to answer it. And I know that might not be what the kids who want to slack off or don't want to read the novel don't want to hear, but that's why various notes and that are there so they can cheat. That was a joke. And there's also with the external exam, the analytical essay, as I said, are they going to take an invited or resistant reading? And if you want them to take a resistant reading, then you're going to have to teach them how to actually do that. So it's not a case of teaching them one way to respond to that external exam. So this is my conclusion. I've only got 2 more slides to go. The first thing is, based on what we've just said though, there are implications for backward mapping from 7 through to 12. Because you don't want to be throwing that framework at them in Unit 4. So you need to think about how you're going to backward map. This is the really... Oh, what happened there? I somehow managed to turn that off. This is the really important bit of what I want to say here though, and that is that I'm not saying, however, that kids should be doing lots of unseen analytical essays from year 8 onwards. And I know that that is happening in some schools because I've seen it. And the other thing I'm not saying is you have to privilege analytical responses over critical responses. There we go. In fact, I think that a lot of what I've just talked about, you could teach the kids through getting them to do that stuff in their own writing of short stories, etc. And I think it's actually a really good reason not to get rid of short story writing. Because if the kids are writing short stories, you can help them, okay, who's the focalising character going to be? Are you going to tell this in first person, second person? And if you make it explicit and link it to this overall framework, then when you come to analyse novels, they've had experience with doing it themselves, so hopefully they will understand much better how to do it and how to analyse it as well. All right, the final slide before you get to go to lunch. This has all been part of a large promotional stunt by me. We do. Chapter 7 of the book that Kelly, Sophie and I have been doing is actually an elaboration, a detailed elaboration of that framework. It uses Lady Helen and the Dark Days Club as a sample text, but that sample text, it doesn't matter if you don't study the book, you can actually, there's enough information there that kids can understand the framework and the examples that are given from Lady Helen without having read the book. They can then use a book that they have written, a book that they've read in order to actually then apply that framework to that book. And finally, I should put in an ad, at the next ETAQ masterclass, I will be talking about invited and resistant readings in terms of doing analytical essays or critical responses over the Saturday and the Sunday. And hey, if you want me to talk more about this at your school, I'm happy to come out to your school for a small fee. Okay.